Okay, so I just want to talk about this comment because I didn't run into it until after I did the solution, and it's a really good point to understand why. So what I did is I went over to chat and actually put in the two types, the difference between these functions, and I asked, what's the difference? That was my question. What's the difference between these two code samples in terms of the JavaScript interpreter? Because I just couldn't remember what would have caused that error. And as I was looking through it, here was the key. And it's something if you haven't heard this term, it's called hoisting. And hoisting is the idea that when JavaScript, the interpreter, the engine itself goes through, in this case, it declares these, sets them up in memory so that you can use them, and this is the key, before, right? You can call them before it's, meaning, let me just read it, right? The function declaration is hoisted, meaning it can be called before it is defined in code, because even before the code goes line by line to execute, it's already set them up. But in this case of using the const, it's not. Which, by the way, this idea of hoisting is also why we try to stay away from using var, because it is also hoisted. So if you've ever heard that point, in this case, it's just the way the JavaScript engine goes through your code, because there's actually a couple of passes that gets done before your code actually gets to the point of executing line by line. Okay, it sets certain things up. So in that storage file, it couldn't, because of the way we changed these to const, right? It wasn't available to us. So having that at the top is what threw that off. So it was trying to run this before it had actually this available to it based on the interpreter. And that's called hoisting. Okay, just FYI. All right, so let's actually now, I'm going to go back to main. And let's just for a moment review functions, right? So at this point we know, right? So if I declare a function, add to, right? I know I'm declaring it, right? I'm going to call function, probably going to pass something into it, okay? So this is the process of declaring the function, right? And so what's inside of here now are the expressions that are inside, right? So we could say, if I'm adding 2 to something, I could just say console.log, right? Something like 2 plus 2, okay? Now, in this case, nothing happens until, and I know this is review, but review is good, okay? Because sometimes we forget stuff. And you're getting ready to write functions for your dev work, and so having this review, I think, would be timely. I can name a function pretty much anything I want as long as I've stayed within the constraints of the JavaScript interpreter. If you see an error when you've named something, I believe like if we started with 2, that wouldn't work. I think that's one of them. And there's a whole list of rules, but in general, right, just name it what it is. Okay. So in this case, when we run this code, now this is called calling the function, because if we just create the function without calling it, nothing happens. Now, so we could do that, right? And again, if you're not, let me go ahead and start my live server. If you're not using DevTools, you really need to be. Because DevTools is so helpful when you're looking at your functions. So I'm going to go to source, I'm going to go to main, right? So in this case, I'm going to come down here, right? And I'm going to put a breakpoint right there. Okay, so this is just going, this is setting out on the global scope, right? This is declared, right? So in this case, if I had tried to call that before I had, in this case, declared it, it wouldn't have worked based on our last one. So if I just hit refresh here, right? And by the way, again, I'm going to repeat. Using DevTools is really helpful, because what happens is this line is now saying, okay, I'm active on this line. I have myself paused. What do you want me to do? And this is very likely something I could ask you during a code review, is walk me through this code. So, and I'll say set a breakpoint at this line and walk me through it. So if I hit step, this would say execute that line. And now we're inside the function. Okay, so now we're block scoped inside that function. And if I hit step, right, then it's going to execute, and then I see the result here. Okay, now by the way, at this point, it is now at the last step, and now it returns control back to the function. Okay, so it calls the function, it runs the code in the function, and then it returns control. Now, this now sets up also the idea of, and we'll talk about a return in a minute, but these, when we're sending something to, right, it's called an argument, right? When we receive it inside, it's called a parameter, okay? Often referred to args and params. Now, I'm just putting these words here. Right now, this wouldn't work. I'm just giving you the terms that these represent because it is important to understand. Because you can name these whatever you want, but understanding when you pass something in, when you pass something to a function, right? That's an argument that it then becomes a parameter inside of the function. Okay, so let's say we pass we pass a value. Okay, so now in this case, we're passing by value. And inside of here, we could keep it as parm, but then that 3 becomes, right, this. So we could probably, in this case, and we could keep it as that, or we could name it something very simple. Now, in this case, 2 plus 2, we'd probably want to say 2 plus a. Okay, so again, this is where your dev tools, if you're unsure of what's happening here, it is so helpful, because now when I'm stopped on this point, I step in. Now I can actually see what was being passed in, and this is being passed by value. Okay, now that's opposed to pass by reference, which I'll cover later, and just know that it's passing this as a value, and this A is now declared inside of this block and is only available inside of this block. This A is not available outside of it because this is block scoped. So now inside this block scope, I can read things from the global scope, but the global scope can't read things inside the block scope. Okay, so just think about that for a minute and set. So block scoped, we're passing an argument, becomes a parameter. We're passing it as a value, so that A is declared within that scope. And now we're going to run the statement, okay, expression, and that's when we go, okay, 2 plus, right? And now we know that's 5. And at this point, it returns control back to the function. So it calls the function, runs the function, control comes back. Okay, now at that point, it just runs some other stuff. And we don't care about that right now. So this is your standard run-of-the-mill function. Okay, it is still somewhat considered a traditional function. We're going to start arrow functions. That's going to be our code challenge for this week. But I wanted to actually bring this back around to talk about now. In this case, I'm just running something. What if I wanted to return a value? Okay, if I said return a, or 2 plus a. Okay, so now when I call this function here, and I return something, now what I'm doing is when I return that, whatever the result, because it'll evaluate this expression, it'll determine what that value is, and then it'll say return it. By the way, it always returns something. It always returns. The question is whether it returns something that you then have available to you on the global scope and for you to use later. It returns no matter what, but without actually giving it an explicit value you want returned, right? In this case, this is only part of the job. We're saying, okay, return it, right? So let's again, we'll run this, let it run. Okay, so now we hit run. We know we're still passing. We're declaring now A, but now we're returning. Okay, doing the calculation, evaluating the expression, returning whatever it was that was the result. Okay, and now we're passing back. But in this case, can we now use that value, that return value somewhere? And the answer is no. Okay, we've returned it, but we haven't actually then declared a variable. And I often call this I can't use it because I haven't captured it. Okay, so and this is where you'd say const result equal. And by doing this now, when I call it, pass in the value, JavaScript evaluates the expression and then says return whatever the result is, and when it returns, that's what that value becomes. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. Stop right now, right? Do we have a README file for week 10? I don't think we do. So I want you to create a README file. I want you to then, in your README file, tell me how much of that did you already understand, or did that help you understand functions a little more? So again, create that README file in here. Oh, right? README. Because I'm going to continue on, but I want you to commit that, okay? I want you to give me some feedback there, because I think there's many of you that do, and it's okay if you don't. This is why I'm doing it right now. Okay, so let's move on and talk about some other things about functions, because we've just touched on functions barely. And it's okay. This is a beginning class. It's completely appropriate. But there's a couple of things that you might want to know for future reference. Like one of the things we can do here, right? We can, if for some reason somebody called a function, but they didn't actually pass a value in, we could set a default value here, something like this. Now, just don't get confused. We're just saying if I don't pass in something, let's pass in 10. And what this says, if when you call the function you do not pass it a value, I'm going to assume that input, I'm going to set that input value that comes in. I'm going to declare it, I'm going to assign it as 10, and then I'll use that in the function. Okay? Again, here, and you might ask yourself, in what case might you do that? There's various ways when you're writing functions that you could think of, because your code gets more and more expansive, as you already see in our class. So there's just many different times that you might want to say, hey, I'm going to set that default function in case somewhere else in my code I may not, in that situation, have passed that value. Now in this case, you can kind of think of this as error checking. Okay, also just making your code more resilient. And the term that we often refer to this kind of coding, where we're making sure our code runs in as many different cases as we can, is called edge case. Make sure that you think about all the different ways your code is run and account for that in your code to make your code, or at least try to ensure your code runs as high a probability with the way you would want it to as possible. In other words, does it actually do what you want it to do? Okay, so this is called, and put this in your notes, a default value. Now let's actually look at it work, because it is good to see. And I'm going to refresh. Okay, so now look, it set it as 10, right? Now it's coming back, and now we have that variable. Oh, again, back here. Right, so now we have that accessible, or that variable accessible to us by using that default value. Okay. Okay, so that's one thing. So default value is great to know. By the way, if we wanted to, the other thing we can do, and this is a term, it's called a REST argument. Okay. I think it's called REST argument. I should look it up. Okay. And this is where, if I'm passing multiple things into a function, like if I wanted to pass 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? I'm passing them in like this. Each of them now is a different parameter. It's called spread. Sorry, it's not REST. It's called spread, I think. What I could do up in here is, and again, I'm now changing this, and I could do ... right? A if I wanted. And then in here, inside of my code, I can then reference that because now that is passing that as an array. And let me just show you before we write the code for this. Okay. So here we go. Now that I'm passing that, I'm calling it, I'm passing it in 3 arguments. But notice what happens here. Those 3 arguments now become an array that is defined in here. And now I can, and I'd have to modify, and that's what we'll do next, the A to then say which of these values. And that would be where you might write some logic to actually say which of those values do I want to use in my code, right? So you could write conditional logic that would say if, right, A1 is greater than a certain number. And it just, now you might wonder, why are we doing this? Well, we kind of saw already in our own code, and we'll come back to that, where we're passing in, right, all of these things. Now, I, in a sense, like this because it's more clear, more declarative of what we're doing. And there are times when I wouldn't use this. Let me just make sure that is this JavaScript. I gotta make sure. Sorry, I should have done this before, but I think it's the spread. Is it the spread or rest? There it is. There it is. Right. Yeah, so there's many different ways to use this idea of this spread. Okay. I'm just showing you the way we're passing it in as a value. You can also use it on objects. So let's now modify our code to reference, let's say we wanted, because it's an array, so now let's say we wanted, we know it's 0, 1, 2, 3, right? So let's say I wanted that 4 to be added. Come back here. Good. Okay, so now let's run it. We hit this. Good. So now, in this line, right, we see, and by the way, again, DevTools is really trying to help us understand what's going on here, right? So now it's looking at that, what we're passing in, it's converting it into an array. It's then inside the function saying, okay, pull out or reference the indices 3, which we know 0, 1, 2, 3 is 4. So what should come back here, right, is 6, which would make sense, right? 4 plus 2. Okay, so those are just 2 things. I do want to, and I will provide this link. One of the things I spent some time doing today was I went through and looked at this video, which I thought was good. And it definitely does a deeper dive in terms of JavaScript functions. I mean, we've talked about JavaScript functions. I just think he does a really nice job understanding scope. Matter of fact, this is probably one of the better parts, I thought. Matter of fact, this idea right here, I think is worth it. And it's the outer function and the inner function, and how, and this is what these arrows indicate, is the inner function can read outside. And this is where you could think of this as either the global scope, or if you had nested functions, okay, you had a function inside here that had a a function with an inner function, but you can also think of this as global and block. And within that block scope, you can then, if it's a nested function, meaning another one, then that function would then follow these same rules to where you can read the variables, right? You can read something that's defined in its parent scope outside. But in this case, the outside can't read what's inside. And what this creates is the possibility now that we can close up. I've used the term closure. Let me show you where we've actually already used closure is here in our render, where we set up, do I have the render open? Yeah. Here, where we're passing, where we set up the event listeners, right? Passing in these the object, the index, and the data. And what happens is now because we have this, in this sense, it is a nested function inside of a function. Okay. But it is because we're passing these things in, following this rule, what happens is even after the execution of the JavaScript engine finishes, we still have access to these things because, and I always kind of say this as a way to help you understand, it's closed up inside of this function. Okay, it's not available to us on the global scope, and at that point, when this is triggered, our global scope, our code has actually completely run, and now this is asynchronous code, which we will start talking about synchronous and asynchronous soon. Okay, so I'm going to give you this link if you want to take a deeper dive into functions. I think that is really helpful. He does talk about IFEs, which is immediately invoked function expression. He talks about higher order functions. So if you're somebody, and pure functions, which that was new for me, I'd never heard the term, but it totally made sense. It's basically a function that returns the same thing every time you call it. Again, IFEs are that you don't necessarily, it's not that you don't call them. They're immediately, it's the way that they're set up. They immediately load as soon, or they immediately execute as soon as your page is loaded. Generally, we don't see much IFEs anymore. And again, I'm kind of just throwing some new terms at you. Immediately invoked function expression. And it'd be something like, we could do it with an arrow function, but you can also do something like this. Okay, and you could say pass something into it, right? And in this case, what you have to do is you actually have to call it. Okay, and you'd pass a into it. And what would happen is this would, as soon as the page is loaded, it will be called a. Okay, so you don't have to do anything. I think I wrote that right. Let's see if I did. To where immediately it's not defined, passed in. Yeah, I just forgot a part of it. But it's just the idea of, let me just think about that for a second. I'm passing in a, should have worked okay. Matter of fact, one of the things I'd probably go look at, because I remember seeing when we were looking at, and that's the other link I would give you here, the other recommendation is actually to look at arrow functions. Because arrow functions have a different page on MDN, and I'll give you this reference as well. And in this case, it talks about IFEs. There we go. So, and when you look at some code like this, it's like how this actually is not actually a running, it's a traditional anonymous function. But in this case, I must have forgot something. I'm not returning console logging. I don't know if it's in the other one. All right, hold on, I'm going to figure this out so I can show you good code versus not. Yeah, that was a good one. And it was really, and this is part of it, in order for this function to immediately run, immediately be invoked, you have to declare, in this case, what I'm passing into it. Now, had I not passed anything into it, it would have worked fine. Okay, but just show you that. And that was my fault. I could have just said, right, if I'm not passing anything into it, then I could just said inside IFE. IFE, immediately invoked function expression. We see these actually more when we look at frameworks, because sometimes this used to be the way jQuery would load. It would just be sitting there, and that's part of the reason jQuery has become kind of out of date, is that, let's let that run just to show you. All right, so now it runs, but because I was passing something into it, I had to declare it for it to run, and then I could use that variable here, but it still loads as soon as it's in here. Okay, as soon as the page loads, so it loads, it executes immediately. So I would just do a here. Actually, why did I do add to? Oh, I must have been somewhere else. Add a. Okay, so in that case, I can still run it. So there's a couple terms we've introduced to you this time: the spread operator, the default operator. I talked to you about IFEs, at least to give you an example. We didn't code anything in our app, but what I want you to do is update your README file with some of the things that you've learned, and you do want to have at least this code in here. And then what we're going to do is move along, and then I'm going to walk you through, now that we've set up everything, we're going to actually have I'll go over in the, well, actually I'll leave that for the discussion. Okay. I hope this also review of how functions, the basics around functions, how to pass functions, how to return values was helpful to you as well. All right, see you later. Oh, you can, this will be the last one for this one. You can commit your commit history for this code along.